The boarding area was bustling with travelers of all kinds. The last-minute rush of people making their way to the gates, the chatter of excited conversations, and the occasional call for boarding made the air electric. It was a typical day at the airport, but for one young boy it was about to be anything but typical. Jamal Turner, a 16-year-old high school student, stood near the gate for his flight, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hoodie pulled up over his head. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floors as he glanced nervously at the gate staff, awaiting the announcement for first-class boarding. He didn't look like the usual first-class passengers. No tailored suits or designer bags here. In fact, Jamal's casual attire of jeans and a plain hoodie made him seem like any other teenager traveling to visit family or heading off on a vacation. But Jamal wasn't just any teenager. He was about to board a plane in a way that would change his life and the lives of everyone around him. As the gate attendant began calling for first-class boarding, Jamal took a deep breath and stood up. His hands were sweaty, and his heart raced. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but today he had a purpose. He wasn't just flying to a new destination. He was flying with the weight of his family's legacy behind him. The passengers near the gate barely noticed as Jamal made his way to the front of the line. They were all too caught up in their own worlds, ready to board their own flights. But as Jamal passed by, a few of the first-class passengers couldn't help but glance at him. His youthful appearance and unassuming demeanor didn't exactly scream first class. One woman, a middle-aged traveler with a stern look and expensive sunglasses, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a mistake?" she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for those around her to hear. Another man, dressed in a crisp suit and tie, sneered as he adjusted his collar. "Is he lost? I don't think he belongs here." Jamal heard the comments, but he didn't let them faze him. He simply continued to walk, his gaze fixed ahead. His hands were clenched by his sides, but he knew this moment was bigger than the whispered judgments of a few strangers. As he stepped onto the plane, the flight attendants greeted him with a polite smile. But there was no mistaking the surprise in their eyes as he handed over his boarding pass. Jamal wasn't the typical first-class passenger, and they all knew it. But Jamal didn't care about their confusion. He wasn't just a kid who didn't fit in. He had a legacy to uphold. A legacy that would soon make everyone understand exactly who he was. He made his way to his seat, taking a deep breath as he settled into the plush leather chair. The surrounding passengers gave him sideways glances, but none of them said a word. The woman with the sunglasses shot him one last look of disbelief, and the man in the suit adjusted his position, clearly uncomfortable by Jamal's presence. The plane began to fill with the hum of conversation, but Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. He had earned his place here, and soon, everyone on this flight would know it. As Jamal settled into his seat, the hum of the cabin seemed to grow louder, as if the whispers around him were building into a crescendo. Passengers continued to board, taking their seats in first class, some glancing at Jamal with an air of confusion, others with barely concealed disdain. It wasn't hard to spot the subtle reactions, discreet glances over the rims of sunglasses, sideways looks, and whispered comments. Jamal kept his eyes forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. His thoughts were racing, but he forced himself to focus on the present. He wasn't here by accident. He belonged here, despite what anyone thought. The flight attendants continued their rounds, offering beverages and snacks as the plane prepared for takeoff. Jamal's eyes briefly flickered toward one of the flight attendants, a young woman with a friendly smile, but even she seemed to hesitate before offering him the typical first-class treatment. Her smile faltered for just a split second before she handed him a glass of water, her voice polite but tinged with uncertainty. "Anything else I can get you, sir?" she asked, her tone noticeably more cautious than the others. "No, thank you," Jamal replied, his voice steady despite the discomfort that was bubbling up inside him. He wanted to tell her that he belonged, that he wasn't some mistake. But he knew it wasn't her fault. It wasn't even the other passengers' fault. The discomfort he was feeling was a reflection of something much deeper: society's expectations, their biases, their assumptions about who should be allowed to sit in first class. As the plane started its taxi to the runway, Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of eyes on him. He tried to ignore the awkward tension, choosing instead to focus on the sound of the engines starting up. Soon, the plane would be in the air, and the discomfort would dissipate. But for now, it felt like every glance was directed at him, scrutinizing, judging, questioning his place here. It wasn't long before the woman with the sunglasses leaned toward the man seated next to her, her voice pitched low but still clearly audible. "I don't know about you, but I've never seen a kid in first class who wasn't with their parents," she whispered, her eyes flickering over to Jamal with a mixture of suspicion and distaste. The man in the suit, who had been quietly observing Jamal since he boarded, smirked. "Must have been a mistake. Maybe the kid's traveling alone." The woman nodded, her gaze still fixed on Jamal. "I mean, I get it. We all want a little luxury, but this doesn't feel right." Jamal's stomach twisted. He didn't respond. He couldn't. There was nothing he could say to change their minds, nothing that would make them see him for who he truly was. He wasn't just a kid in first class. He wasn't some mistake or an anomaly. He had worked hard to be here. His family had worked harder. The plane's engines roared louder as it began its ascent, the force of the takeoff pressing Jamal back into his seat. For a moment he closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, focusing on the sensation of the plane lifting into the sky, the sound of the engine filling his ears. It was his anchor, the one thing that could calm his nerves. But even as the plane soared higher, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. The whispers hadn't stopped. The looks hadn't gone away. And then, just as the plane leveled out, something strange happened. A voice, firm and commanding, rang out over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to have you on board today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce a very special passenger flying with us today." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Why was the captain mentioning him? The voice continued. "We are honored to have with us the grandson of a legendary figure in aviation, Mr. Jamal Turner, heir to the Turner Aviation legacy." Jamal froze. He hadn't been expecting this. Jamal's eyes widened as the announcement echoed through the cabin. The voice on the intercom continued. Jamal's grandfather, the late William Turner, founded Turner Aviation, one of the most successful and pioneering aviation companies in the world. His contributions to the industry are countless, and his legacy lives on in his family. Please join me in honoring Mr. Turner's legacy and in welcoming his grandson aboard. The cabin fell silent. Jamal could feel the collective shift in energy as the passengers processed the information. The whispers that had once been filled with skepticism and doubt were now replaced with shocked murmurs and hushed conversations. He could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they suddenly realized who he was. The woman with the sunglasses was the first to break the silence, her jaw practically dropping. She exchanged a stunned look with the man in the suit, who seemed equally taken aback. Jamal had always known this moment would come. He had known that people would question him, doubt him, and assume he didn't belong. But he hadn't expected this kind of revelation to hit so suddenly. His grandfather's name had been synonymous with excellence in aviation, and now that legacy was thrust into the open, under the spotlight of curious onlookers. Jamal felt his face flush both from embarrassment and a rush of pride. It wasn't the first time he had been recognized as William Turner's grandson, but it was the first time it had happened so publicly, especially in such a setting. The flight attendants, who had initially treated Jamal with an air of uncertainty, were now offering him polite smiles, nodding respectfully as they passed by. They must have known about his family's legacy, but seeing it unfold in real time must have been surreal for them too. Across the aisle, Jamal caught the eyes of the man in the suit, who had been so quick to judge him earlier. The man's expression had shifted. What was once a look of disdain was now replaced by a sheepish look of realization. Jamal could almost see the apology in the man's eyes, though he didn't say a word. The woman with the sunglasses, who had made her snide comments earlier, now seemed flustered, her fingers twitching as she adjusted her glasses. She seemed unsure whether to approach Jamal or to remain silent. The weight of her earlier judgment hung in the air, but now it was clear to everyone that Jamal wasn't some random teenager who didn't belong. He was a part of something much bigger. Jamal didn't feel like acknowledging the shift in atmosphere. He didn't need their recognition. He wasn't here to prove anything to them. He had already proven himself in his own way. But the look of surprise on their faces was almost too much to ignore. A few seats away, an older woman leaned over to her seatmate and whispered, "I remember reading about Turner Aviation when I was younger. It's incredible to think that the founder's legacy is still alive in his family. And now, his grandson's here." The seatmate nodded in agreement. "I guess we all make assumptions, don't we?" he murmured, almost apologetically. Jamal kept his gaze straight ahead, his hands now resting on the armrests. He had expected this moment to feel different, maybe more triumphant. But instead it felt like a quiet affirmation of everything his grandfather had built, and everything Jamal had yet to prove. He wasn't just the grandson of William Turner. He was Jamal Turner, a teenager trying to make his own mark in the world, whether the world was ready for him or not. The rest of the flight proceeded in relative silence. The passengers who had once ridiculed him now seemed to sit in uneasy respect. They knew who Jamal was, but more importantly, they now understood the gravity of his presence. Jamal wasn't just a passenger. He was heir to a powerful legacy, and whether they liked it or not, he had earned his place in first class. As the flight continued, Jamal could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. At first, it had been uncomfortable, almost suffocating. The whispered comments, the sideways glances, the judgments that came from his appearance and the surprise of his place in first class. It had all been too much. But now, with the revelation about his grandfather's legacy, the atmosphere had shifted. Jamal had never asked for the attention, nor had he ever wanted to be recognized for something he had no control over. But there it was, his family's name, his grandfather's legacy, all coming to the forefront. He hadn't asked for it, but he couldn't deny it either. His grandfather had built an empire, and now that legacy was his to carry. He looked out the window, watching the clouds drift lazily beneath the plane. His thoughts began to wander back to the stories his parents had told him about his grandfather, William Turner, the visionary who had founded Turner Aviation. The company had revolutionized the way people thought about air travel, pushing boundaries and breaking records in the industry. Turner Aviation wasn't just a company, it was a symbol of resilience, innovation, and a legacy that had spanned decades. Jamal could almost hear his grandfather's voice in his head, telling him about the sacrifices and the struggles that had come with building something so monumental. William Turner had worked tirelessly, often at the expense of his own personal life, to ensure that the company would thrive. But he had also made sure that the next generation would be prepared to continue his work, to carry his vision forward. As Jamal thought about the weight of his family's legacy, he began to feel a sense of responsibility, one that had been ingrained in him from a young age. He had grown up hearing about Turner Aviation, but it wasn't until now, sitting in first class on a plane full of strangers who had once doubted him, that he truly understood what it meant. The announcement over the intercom broke his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our destination. Please prepare for landing." Jamal blinked and glanced around the cabin. The passengers were beginning to collect their belongings, some murmuring to each other in low voices. There was still an underlying tension in the air, but it had softened. They no longer saw him as just a kid who didn't belong. They saw him for what he was, an heir to a legacy that had shaped an entire industry. The woman with the sunglasses, who had once mocked him, turned to her seatmate and said, "I didn't realize who he was. His grandfather. He built one of the most successful aviation companies in the world. It's incredible." Her seatmate nodded. "Yeah, it's humbling. I guess we all make judgments too quickly. I mean, we don't really know anyone just by looking at them." Jamal couldn't help but overhear their conversation. He didn't respond, but a small part of him felt vindicated. The passengers had begun to realize their mistake, though it wasn't something he was gloating about. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. His place in first class, his family's legacy, none of it defined who he was. He was Jamal Turner, a teenager with a future of his own to carve out. As the plane descended toward the runway, Jamal couldn't help but wonder how things would be different once they landed. Would the passengers remember this moment? Would they continue to carry with them the lesson of judgment and assumption? Or would they forget, moving on to the next flight, the next person to look down upon. Either way, Jamal knew one thing. This was only the beginning. His grandfather's legacy was part of him, but he was determined to make his own name in the world. He wouldn't be defined by the expectations of others. He would be defined by his actions, his choices, and the path he forged for himself. The plane landed smoothly, and the seatbelt sign flashed off. Jamal sat still for a moment, letting the hum of the cabin die down as passengers began to gather their belongings. The atmosphere, once tense and filled with judgment, was now quieter, more reflective. Jamal could feel the shift, a softening in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had just been revealed. As the doors of the plane opened and passengers began to file out, Jamal stood up slowly, adjusting the strap of his backpack. He didn't rush to gather his things or push past others in the way that some passengers did. He took his time, knowing that for the first time on this flight, the people around him saw him for who he was. Not just a kid in casual clothes, but the grandson of a legendary aviation pioneer. The woman with the sunglasses who had once whispered and judged him was now standing at the door of the plane. As Jamal passed by her, she glanced at him and hesitated for a moment, her eyes softer than they had been before. "I didn't realize who you were," she said quietly, her tone almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for assuming." Jamal gave her a small, polite nod. There was no need for a long conversation. Her apology, though unspoken until now, was enough. He didn't need her validation, but it was still a subtle reminder of how much perceptions could change in an instant. "Thank you," he replied simply. The man in the suit, who had sneered at Jamal earlier, also stood by the door, looking almost uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped himself. Instead, he offered a strained smile, his eyes meeting Jamal's briefly before he quickly looked away. It was clear that the man didn't know how to respond to what had just unfolded. His earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by a kind of humility that only came from realizing how wrong his assumptions had been. But Jamal wasn't interested in rubbing it in. He had his own path to follow, and he didn't have time to dwell on others' mistakes. As Jamal walked down the jet bridge toward the terminal, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not because of the apology or the uncomfortable glances, but because the situation had done exactly what he had hoped. It had forced everyone to confront their assumptions and biases. Jamal knew that his grandfather's legacy was a powerful thing, but he also knew that it wasn't the only thing that defined him. He wasn't just William Turner's grandson. He was Jamal Turner, a teenager with dreams of his own, a future of his own to create. The legacy he carried was important, but it was only one part of the story. He had much more to offer the world than the name he had inherited. As Jamal walked through the terminal, the whispers had mostly faded. People were still milling about, going about their business. But there was an unspoken shift in the way they looked at him. No one said anything, but he could feel it. Their perceptions had been altered. For Jamal, this wasn't just about the recognition, it was about understanding his own worth. He didn't need anyone's approval, and he didn't need to prove anything. His grandfather's legacy would always be a part of him, but it wouldn't be the only thing that defined him. Jamal Turner was his own person, and he was ready to carve out his own path. As he walked toward the exit, a few people gave him a nod or a smile, but he didn't stop. The journey wasn't over. He was only just getting started. As Jamal exited the airport, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't the kind of relief you feel when you escape a difficult situation. It was the relief that comes from knowing that something significant had just happened. He wasn't sure exactly what that was yet, whether it was the fact that his family's legacy had been revealed to the passengers on the plane, or if it was simply the realization that he was now in control of his own story. Either way, something had shifted. Outside, the city was bustling with life. People hurried by, oblivious to the small life-changing moment that had just occurred in the plane. Jamal had always known he was part of something bigger than himself, his grandfather's company, his family's history. But today it felt different. The legacy was no longer something distant. It was something Jamal was carrying with him every day. But today, he also realized that the legacy wasn't just a weight. It was a foundation. As he walked toward the taxi stand, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jamal pulled it out, curious. It was a message from his mom. "I saw the news. Proud of you. You're more than just a name. Keep going." Jamal smiled as he read the message. His mom had always been supportive, always reminding him that he wasn't just his grandfather's grandson. He was his own person. He replied quickly, "Thanks, Mom. I'm figuring it out. I'm ready for whatever comes next." The taxi arrived and Jamal climbed into the back seat, settling in. As the car drove through the busy streets, he thought about what had happened over the past few hours. He had been judged for his clothes, for his appearance, for the simple fact that he didn't look like the typical first-class passenger. He had been ridiculed and whispered about, but now everyone knew who he was. And yet, Jamal knew that this moment was just the beginning. It wasn't about the attention or the apology. It was about what he did next. He wasn't going to let the legacy of Turner Aviation define him. He was going to create his own path. His grandfather had built something extraordinary, but Jamal had his own dreams. He had his own vision for the future, one that didn't need anyone's approval. As the taxi passed through the city, Jamal's thoughts turned to his future. He wasn't sure exactly where it would take him, but for the first time he felt sure of one thing. He was going to make it. He wasn't going to live in the shadow of his grandfather's achievements. He was going to stand on his own 2 feet, and whether or not people recognized his family's name, he would make sure they recognized his worth. Jamal looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt before. The world had seen him for who he truly was, not just a kid trying to fit in, not just the grandson of a famous man, but someone who was ready to write his own story. And with that, Jamal Turner stepped into his future, leaving the judgments of others behind.